Judiciary and Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on Facebook's social media privacy and the use and abuse of data. Although not unprecedented, this is a unique hearing. The issues we will consider range from data privacy and security to consumer protection and the Federal Trade Commission enforcement, touching on jurisdictions of these two committees. We have 44 members between our two committees. That may not seem like a large group by Facebook standards, but it is significant here for a hearing in the United States Senate. We will do our best to keep things moving efficiently given our circumstances. We will begin with opening statements from the chairman and ranking members of each committee, starting with Chairman Thune, and then proceed with Mr. Zuckerberg's opening statement. We will then move on to questioning. Each member will have 5 minutes to question witnesses. I'd like to remind the members of both committees that time limits will be and must be strictly enforced given the numbers that we have here today. If you're over your time, Chairman Thune and I will make sure to let you know. There will not be a second round as well. Of course, there will be the usual follow-up written questions for the record. Questioning will alternate between majority and minority and between committees. We will proceed in order based on respective committee seniority. We will anticipate a couple short breaks later in the afternoon, and so it's my pleasure to recognize the chairman of the Commerce Committee, Chairman Thune, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley. Today's hearing is extraordinary. It's extraordinary to hold a joint committee hearing. It's even more extraordinary to have a single CEO testify before nearly half of the United States Senate. But then Facebook is pretty extraordinary. More than 2 billion people use Facebook every month. 1.4 billion people use it every day. More than the population of any country on earth except China, and more than 4 times the population of the United States. It's also more than 1,500 times the population of my home state of South Dakota. Plus, roughly 45% of American adults report getting at least some of their news from Facebook. In many respects, Facebook's incredible reach is why we're here today. We're here because of what you, Mr. Zuckerberg, have described as a breach of trust. A quiz app used by approximately 300,000 people led to information about 87 million Facebook users being obtained by the company Cambridge Analytica. There are plenty of questions about the behavior of Cambridge Analytica, and we expect to hold a future hearing on Cambridge and similar firms. But as you've said, this is not likely to be an isolated incident, a fact demonstrated by Facebook's suspension of another firm just this past weekend. You've promised that when Facebook discovers other apps that had access to large amounts of user data, you will ban them until those affected. And that's appropriate. But it's unlikely to be enough for the 2 billion Facebook users. One reason that so many people are worried about this incident is what it says about how Facebook works. The idea that for every person who decided to try an app, information about nearly 300 other people was scraped from your services, to put it mildly, disturbing. And the fact that those 87 million people may have technically consented to making their data available doesn't make most people feel any better. The recent revelation that malicious actors were able to utilize Facebook's default privacy settings to match email addresses and phone numbers found on the so-called dark web to public Facebook profiles, potentially affecting all Facebook users, only adds fuel to the fire. What binds these two incidents is that they don't appear to be caused by the kind of negligence that allows typical data breaches to happen. Instead, they both appear to be the result of people exploiting the very tools that you've created to manipulate users' information. I know Facebook has taken several steps and intends to take more to address these issues. Nevertheless, some have warned that the actions Facebook is taking to ensure that third parties don't obtain data from unsuspecting users, while necessary, will actually serve to enhance Facebook's own ability to market such data exclusively. Most of us understand that whether you're using Facebook or Google or some other online services, we are trading certain information about ourselves for free or low-cost services. But for this model to persist, both sides of the bargain need to know the stakes that are involved. Right now, I'm not convinced that Facebook's users have the information that they need to make meaningful choices. In the past, many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been willing to defer to tech companies' efforts to regulate themselves. But this may be changing. Just last month, in overwhelming bipartisan fashion, Congress voted to make it easier for prosecutors and victims to go after websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking. This should be a wake-up call for the tech community. We want to hear more, without delay, about what Facebook and other companies plan to do to take greater responsibility for what happens on their platforms. How will you protect users' data? How will you inform users about the changes that you are making? And how do you intend to proactively stop harmful conduct instead of being forced to respond to it months or years later? Mr. Zuckerberg, in many ways, you and the company that you've created, the story that you've created, represent the American dream. Many are incredibly inspired by what you've done. At the same time, you have an obligation, and it's up to you, to ensure that that dream doesn't become a privacy nightmare for the scores of people who use Facebook. This hearing is an opportunity to speak to those who believe in Facebook and to those who are deeply skeptical about it. We are listening, America is listening, and quite possibly the world is listening too.
Thank you. Now, Ranking Member Feinstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Grassley, Chairman Thune. Thank you both for holding this hearing. Mr. Zuckerberg, thank you for being here. You have a real opportunity this afternoon to lead the industry and demonstrate a meaningful commitment to protecting individual privacy. We have learned over the past few months, and we've learned a great deal that's alarming. We've seen how foreign actors are abusing social media platforms like Facebook to interfere in elections and take millions of Americans' personal information without their knowledge in order to manipulate public opinion and target individual voters. Specifically, on February the 16th, Special Counsel Mueller issued an indictment against the Russia-based Internet Research Agency and 13 of its employees for interfering operations targeting the United States. Through this 37-page indictment, we learned that the IRA ran a coordinated campaign through 470 Facebook accounts and pages. The campaign included ads and false information to create discord and harm Secretary Clinton's campaign. And the content was seen by an estimated 157 million Americans. A month later, on March 17th, news broke that Cambridge Analytica exploited the personal information of approximately 50 million Facebook users without their knowledge or permission. And last week, we learned that number was even higher, 87 million Facebook users who had their private information taken without their consent. Specifically, using a personality quiz he created, Professor Kogan collected the personal information of 300,000 Facebook users and then collected data on millions of their friends. It appears the information collected included everything these individuals had on their Facebook pages, and according to some reports, even included private direct messages between users. Professor Kogan is said to have taken data from over 70 million Americans. It has also been reported that he sold this data to Cambridge Analytica for $800,000. Cambridge Analytica then took this data and created a psychological welfare tool to influence United States elections. In fact, the CEO, Alexander Nix, declared that Cambridge Analytica.
Chairman Thune, Ranking Member Feinstein, and Ranking Member Nelson, and members of the committee. We face a number of important issues around privacy, safety, and democracy, and you will rightfully have some hard questions for me to answer. Before I talk about the steps we're taking to address them, I want to talk about how we got here. Facebook is an idealistic and optimistic company. For most of our existence, we focused on all of the good that connecting people can do. And as Facebook has grown, people everywhere have gotten a powerful new tool for staying connected to the people they love, for making their voices heard, and for building communities and businesses. Just recently, we've seen the Me Too movement and the March for Our Lives organized, at least in part, on Facebook. After Hurricane Harvey, people came together to raise more than $20 million for relief. And more than 70 million small businesses use Facebook to create jobs and grow. But it's clear now that we didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. And that goes for fake news, for foreign interference in elections, and hate speech, as well as developers and data privacy. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here. So now, we have to go through all of our relationship with people and make sure that we're taking a broad enough view of our responsibility. It's not enough to just connect people. We have to make sure that those connections are positive. It's not enough to just give people a voice. We need to make sure that people aren't using it to harm other people or to spread misinformation. And it's not enough to just give people control over their information. We need to make sure that the developers they share it with protect their information too. Across the board, we have a responsibility to not just build tools, but to make sure that they're used for good. It will take some time to work through all the changes we need to make across the company, but I'm committed to getting this right. This includes the basic responsibility of protecting people's information, which we failed to do with Cambridge Analytica. So here are a few things that we are doing to address this and to prevent it from happening again. First, we're getting to the bottom of exactly what Cambridge Analytica did and telling everyone affected. What we know now is that Cambridge Analytica improperly accessed some information about millions of Facebook members by buying it from an app developer. That information, this was information that people generally share publicly on their Facebook pages, like names and their profile picture and the pages they follow. When we first contacted Cambridge Analytica, they told us that they had deleted the data. About a month ago, we heard new reports that suggested that wasn't true. And now we're working with governments in the US, the UK, and around the world to do a full audit of what they've done and to make sure they get rid of any data they may still have. Second, to make sure no other app developers out there are misusing data, we're now investigating every single app that had access to a large amount of information in the past. And if we find that someone improperly used data, we're going to ban them from Facebook and tell everyone affected. Third, to prevent this from ever happening again going forward, we're making sure that developers can access as much information now. The good news here is that we already made big changes to our platform in 2014 that would have prevented this specific situation with Cambridge Analytica from occurring again today. But there's more to do, and you can find more details on the steps we're taking in my written statement. My top priority has always been our social mission of connecting people, building community, and bringing the world closer together. Advertisers and developers will never take priority over that as long as I'm running Facebook. I started Facebook when I was in college. We've come a long way since then. We now serve more than 2 billion people around the world, and every day, people use our services to stay connected with the people that matter to them most. I believe deeply in what we're doing, and I know that when we address these challenges, we'll look back and view helping people connect and giving more people a voice as a positive force in the world. I realize the issues we're talking about today aren't just issues for Facebook and our community. They're issues and challenges for all of us as Americans. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm ready to take your questions.
I'll remind members that maybe weren't here when I had my opening comments that we are operating under the 5-minute rule, and that applies to the 5-minute rule, and that applies to those of us who are chairing the committee as well. I start with you. Facebook handles extensive amounts of personal data for billions of users. A significant amount of that data is shared with third-party developers who utilize your platform. As of early this year, you did not actively monitor whether that data was transferred by such developers to other parties. Moreover, your policies only prohibit transfers by developers to parties seeking to profit from such data. Number one, besides Professor Kogan's transfer, and now potentially CubeU, do you know of any instances where user data was improperly transferred to third party in breach of Facebook's terms? If so, how many times has that happened? And was Facebook only made aware of that transfer by some third party?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As I mentioned, we're now conducting a full investigation into every single app that had access to a large amount of information before we locked down platform to prevent developers from accessing this information in around 2014. We believe that we're going to be investigating many apps, tens of thousands of apps, and if we find any suspicious activity, we're going to conduct a full audit of those apps to understand how they're using their data and if they're doing anything improper. And if we find that they're doing anything improper, we'll ban them from Facebook, and we will tell everyone affected. As for past activity, I don't have all the examples of apps that we've banned here, but if you'd like, I can have my team follow up with you after this.
Okay. Have you ever required an audit to ensure the deletion of improperly transferred data, and if so, how many times?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we have. I don't have the exact figure on how many times we have, but overall, the way we've enforced our platform policies in the past is we have looked at patterns of how apps have used our APIs and accessed information, as well as looked into reports that people have made to us about apps that might be doing sketchy things. Going forward, we're going to take a more proactive position on this and do much more regular spot checks and other reviews of apps, as well as increasing the amount of audits that we do. And again, I can make sure that our team follows up with you on anything about the specific past stats that would be interesting.
I was going to assume that sitting here today, you have no idea, and if I'm wrong on that, you're telling me, I think, that you're able to supply those figures to us, at least as of this point.
Mr. Chairman, I will have my team follow up with you on what information we have.
Okay, but right now you have no certainty of whether or not, how much of that's going on, right? Okay. Facebook collects massive amounts of data from consumers, including content, networks, contact lists, device information, location, and information from third parties. Yet your data policy is only a few pages long and provides consumers with only a few examples of what is collected and how it might be used. The examples given emphasize benign uses, such as connecting with friends, but your policy does not give any indication for more controversial issues of such data. My question, why doesn't Facebook disclose to its users all the ways the data might be used by Facebook and other third parties, and what is Facebook's responsibility to inform users about that information?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it's important to tell people exactly how the information that they share on Facebook is going to be used. That's why every single time you go to share something on Facebook, whether it's a photo in Facebook or a message in Messenger or WhatsApp, every single time there's a control right there about who you're going to be sharing it with, whether it's your friends or public or a specific group, and you can change that and control that in line. To your broader point about the privacy policy, this gets into an issue that I think we and others in the tech industry have found challenging, which is that long privacy policies are very confusing. And if you make it long and spell out all the detail, then you're probably going to reduce the percent of people who read it and make it accessible to them. So one of the things that we've struggled with over time is to make something that is as simple as possible so people can understand it, as well as giving them controls in line in the product in the context of when they're trying to actually use them, taking into account that we don't expect that most people will want to go through and read a full legal document.
In response to Senator Nelson's question,
Yes.
having to do it over. This may be your first appearance before Congress, but it's not the first time that Facebook has faced tough questions about its privacy policies. Wired magazine recently noted that you have a 14-year history of apologizing for ill-advised decisions regarding user privacy, not unlike the one that you made just now in your opening statement. After more than a decade of promises to do better, how is today's apology different, and why should we trust Facebook to make the necessary changes to ensure user privacy and give people a clearer picture of your privacy policies?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have made a lot of mistakes in running the company. I think it's pretty much impossible, I believe, to start a company in your dorm room and then grow it to be at the scale that we're at now without making some mistakes. And because our service is about helping people connect and information, those mistakes have been different in how we try not to make the same mistake multiple times, but in general, a lot of the mistakes are around how people connect to each other just because of the nature of the service. Overall, I would say that we're going through a broader philosophical shift in how we approach our responsibility as a company. For the first 10 or 12 years of the company, I viewed our responsibility as primarily building tools that if we could put those tools in people's hands, then that would empower people to do good things. What I think we've learned now across a number of issues, not just data privacy, but also fake news and foreign interference in elections, is that we need to take a more proactive role and a broader view of our responsibility. It's not enough to just build tools. We need to make sure that they're used for good. And that means that we need to now take a more active view in policing the ecosystem, and in watching and kind of looking out and making sure that all of the members in our community are using these tools in a way that's going to be good and healthy. So at the end of the day, this is going to be something where people will measure us by our results on this. It's not that I expect that anything I say here today to necessarily change people's view, but I'm committed to getting this right, and I believe that over the coming years, once we fully work all these solutions through, people will see real differences.
Okay. Well, and I'm glad that you all have gotten that message. As we discussed in my office yesterday, the line between legitimate political discourse and hate speech can sometimes be hard to identify, and especially when you're relying on artificial intelligence and other technologies for the initial discovery. Can you discuss what steps that Facebook currently takes when making these evaluations, the challenges that you face, and any examples of where you may draw the line between what is and what is not hate speech?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'll speak to hate speech, and then I'll talk about enforcing our content policies more broadly. So actually, maybe if you're okay with it, I'll go in the other order. So from the beginning of the company in 2004, I started it in my dorm room. It was me and my roommate. We didn't have AI technology that could look at the content that people were sharing, so we basically had to enforce our content policies reactively. People could share what they wanted, and then if someone in the community found it to be offensive or against our policies, they'd flag it for us and we'd look at it reactively. Now, increasingly, we are developing AI tools that can identify certain classes of bad activity proactively and flag it for our team at Facebook. By the end of this year, by the way, we're going to have more than 20,000 people working on security and content review, working across all these things. So when content gets flagged to us, we have those people look at it, and if it violates our policies, then we take it down. Some problems lend themselves more easily to AI solutions than others. So hate speech is one of the hardest, because determining if something is hate speech is very linguistically nuanced, right? You need to understand, what is a slur and whether something is hateful, not just in English, but the majority of people on Facebook use it in languages that are different across the world. Contrast that, for example, with an area like finding terrorist propaganda, which we've actually been very successful at deploying AI tools on already. Today, as we sit here, 99% of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda content that we take down on Facebook, our AI systems flag before any human sees it. So that's a success in terms of rolling out AI tools that can proactively police and enforce safety across the community. Hate speech, I am optimistic that over a 5 to 10 year period, we will have AI tools that can get into some of the nuances, the linguistic nuances of different types of content to be more accurate in flagging things for our systems. But today we're just not there on that. So a lot of this is still reactive. People flag it to us. We have people look at it. We have policies to try to make it as not subjective as possible. But until we get it more automated, there's a higher error rate than I'm happy with.
This is the most intense public scrutiny I've seen for a tech-related hearing since the Microsoft hearing that I chaired back in the late 1990s. The recent stories about Cambridge Analytica and data mining on social media have raised serious concerns about consumer privacy. And naturally, I know you understand that. At the same time, these stories touch on the very foundation of the internet economy and the way the websites that drive our internet economy make money. Some have professed themselves shocked that companies like Facebook and Google share user data with advertisers. Did any of these individuals ever stop to ask themselves why Facebook and Google don't charge for access? Nothing in life is free. Everything involves trade-offs. If you want something without having to pay money for it, you're going to have to pay for it in some other way, it seems to me. And that's what we're seeing here. And these great websites that don't charge for access, they extract value in some other way. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as they're upfront about what they're doing. To my mind, the issue here is transparency. It's consumer choice. Do users understand what they're agreeing to when they access a website or agree to terms of service? Are websites upfront about how they extract value from users, or do they hide the ball? Do consumers have the information they need to make an informed choice regarding whether or not to visit a particular website? To my mind, these are questions that we should ask or be focusing on. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg, I remember well your first visit to Capitol Hill back in 2010. You spoke to the Senate Republican High-Tech Task Force, which I chair. You said back then that Facebook would always be free. Is that still your objective?
Senator, yes, there will always be a version of Facebook that is free. It is our mission to try to help connect everyone around the world and to bring the world closer together. In order to do that, we believe that we need to offer a service that everyone can afford, and we're committed to doing that.
Well, if so, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see. That's great. Whenever a controversy like this arises, there's always a danger that Congress's response will be to step in and overregulate. Now, that's been the experience that I've had in my 42 years here. In your view, what sorts of legislative changes would help to solve the problems the Cambridge Analytica story has revealed, and what sorts of legislative changes would not help to solve this issue?
Senator, I think that there are a few categories of legislation that make sense to consider. Around privacy specifically, there are a few principles that I think it would be useful to discuss and potentially codify into law. One is around having a simple and practical set of ways that you explain what you're doing with data. And we talked a little bit earlier around the complexity of laying out this long privacy policy, it's hard to say that people fully understand something when it's only written out in a long legal document. This stuff needs to be implemented in a way where people can actually understand it, where consumers can understand it, but that can also capture all the nuances of how these services work in a way that's not overly restrictive on providing the services. So that's one. The second is around giving people complete control. This is the most important principle for Facebook. Every piece of content that you share on Facebook, you own, and you have complete control over who sees it and how you share it, and you can remove it at any time. That's why every day, about 100 billion times a day, people come to one of our services and either post a photo or send a message to someone because they know that they have that control and that who they say it's going to go to is going to be who sees the content. And I think that control is something that's important that I think should apply to every service. And
Go ahead.
the third point is just around enabling innovation, because some of these use cases that are very sensitive, like face recognition, for example. And I think that there's a balance that's extremely important to strike here, where you obtain special consent for sensitive features like face recognition, but we still need to make it so that American companies can innovate in those areas, or else we're going to fall behind Chinese competitors and others around the world who have different regimes for different new features like that.
Senator Cantwell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Zuckerberg. Do you know who Palantir is?
I do.
Some people have referred to them as Stanford Analytica. Do you agree?
Senator, I have not heard that.
Okay. Do you think Palantir taught Cambridge Analytica, as press reports are saying, how to do these tactics?
Senator, I don't know.
Do you think that Palantir has ever scraped data from Facebook?
Senator, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Do you think that during the 2016 campaign, as Cambridge Analytica was providing support to the Trump campaign under Project Alamo, were there any Facebook people involved in that sharing of technique and information?
Senator, we provided support to the Trump campaign similar to what we provide to any advertiser or campaign who asks for it.
So that was a yes. Is that a yes?
Senator, can you repeat the specific question? I just want to make sure I get specifically what you're asking.
During the 2016 campaign, Cambridge Analytica worked with the Trump campaign to refine tactics, and were Facebook employees involved in that?
Senator, I don't know that our employees were involved with Cambridge Analytica, although I know that we did help out the Trump campaign overall in sales support in the same way that we do with other campaigns.
So they may have been involved in all working together during that time period. Maybe that's something your investigation will find out.
Senator, I can certainly have my team get back to you on any specifics there that I don't know sitting here today.
Have you heard of total information awareness? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I do not.
Okay. Total information awareness was 2003. John Ashcroft and others trying to do similar things to what I think is behind all of this. Geopolitical forces trying to get data and information to influence a process. So when I look at Palantir and what they're doing, and I look at WhatsApp, which is another acquisition, and I look at where you are from the 2011 consent decree and where you are today, I'm thinking, is this guy outfoxing the foxes, or is he going along with what is a major trend in an information age to try to harvest information for political forces? And so my question to you is, do you see that those applications, that those companies, Palantir and even WhatsApp, are going to fall into the same situation that you've just fallen into over the last several years?
Senator, I'm not sure specifically. Overall, I do think that these issues around information access are challenging. To the specifics about those apps, I'm not really that familiar with what Palantir does. WhatsApp collects very little information, and I think is less likely to have the kind of issues because of the way that the service is architected. But certainly I think that these are broad issues across the tech industry.
Well, I guess, given the track record of where Facebook is and why you're here today, I guess people would say that they didn't act boldly enough. And the fact that people like John Bolton basically was an investor in New York Times article earlier, I guess it was actually last month, that the Bolton Pack was obsessed with how America was becoming limp-wristed and spineless and had wanted research and messaging for national security issues. So the fact that, you know, there are a lot of people who are interested in this larger effort. And what I think my constituents want to know is, was this discussed at your board meetings? And what are the applications and interests that are being discussed without putting real teeth into this? We don't want to come back to this situation again. I believe you have all the talent. My question is whether you have all the will to help us solve this problem.
Yes, Senator. So data privacy and foreign interference in elections are certainly topics that we have discussed at the board meeting. These are some of the biggest issues that the company has faced, and we feel a huge responsibility to get these right.
Do you believe the European regulations should be applied here in the U.S.?
Senator, I think everyone in the world deserves good privacy protection. And regardless of whether we implement the exact same regulation, I would guess that it would be somewhat different because we have somewhat different sensibilities in the U.S. as do other countries. We're committed to rolling out the controls and the affirmative consent and the special controls around sensitive types of technology like face recognition that are required in GDPR. We're doing that around the world. So I think it's certainly worth discussing whether we should have something similar in the US. But what I would like to say today is that we're going to go forward and implement that regardless of what the regulatory outcome is.
Senator Wicker.
Would you be comfortable sharing with us the name of the hotel you stayed in last night? Question basically of what information Facebook's collecting, who they're sending it to, and whether they ever asked me in advance my permission to do that. Is that a fair thing for a user of Facebook to expect?
Yes, Senator. I think everyone should have control over how their information is used. And as we've talked about in some of the other questions, I think that is laid out in some of the documents. But more importantly, you want to give people control in the product itself. So the most important way that this happens across our services is that every day people come to our services to choose to share photos or send messages. And every single time they choose to share something, they have a control right there about who they want to share it with. But that level of control is extremely important.
They certainly know within the Facebook pages who their friends are, but they may not know, as has happened, and you've conceded this point in the past, that sometimes that information is going way beyond their friends, and sometimes people have made money off of sharing that information. Correct?
Senator, you're referring, I think, to our developer platform, and it may be useful for me to give some background on how we set that up, if that's useful.
I have 3 minutes left, so maybe you can do that for the record, because I have a couple of the questions I'd like to ask. You have recently announced something that is called Messenger Kids. Facebook created an app allowing kids between the ages of 6 and 12 to send video and text messages through Facebook as an extension of their parents' account. You have cartoon-like stickers and other features designed to appeal to little kids, first graders, kindergartners. On January 30th, the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood and lots of other child development organizations warned Facebook. They pointed to a wealth of research demonstrating that excessive use of digital devices and social media is harmful to kids, and argued that young children simply are not ready to handle social media accounts at age 6. In addition, there are concerns about data that's being gathered about these kids. Now, there are certain limits in the law, we know. There's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. What guarantees can you give us that no data from Messenger kids is or will be collected or shared with those that might violate that law?
All right, Senator, so a number of things I think are important here. The background on Messenger Kids is we heard feedback from thousands of parents that they want to be able to stay in touch with their kids and call them, use apps like FaceTime when they're working late or not around and want to communicate with their kids, but they want to have complete control over that. So I think we can all agree that when your kid is 6 or 7, even if they have access to a phone, you want to be able to control everyone who they can contact. And there wasn't an app out there that did that. So we built this service to do that. The app collects a minimum amount of information that is necessary to operate the service. So for example, the messages that people send is something that we collect in order to operate the service. But in general, that data is not going to be shared with third parties. It is not connected to the broader Facebook experience.
Excuse me, as a lawyer, I picked up on that word in general, the phrase in general. It seems to suggest that in some circumstances it will be shared with third parties.
No, it will not.
All right. Would you be open to the idea that someone having reached adult age, having grown up with Messenger kids, should be allowed to delete the data that you've collected?
Senator, yes. As a matter of fact, when you become 13, which is our legal limit, or limiter, we don't allow people under the age of 13 to use Facebook, you don't automatically go from having a Messenger Kids account to a Facebook account. You have to start over and get a Facebook account. So I think it's a good idea to consider making sure that all that information is deleted, and in general, people are going to be starting over when they get their Facebook or other accounts.
I'll close because I just have a few seconds. Illinois has a Biometric Information Privacy Act, our state does, which is to regulate the commercial use of facial, voice, finger, and iris scans and the like. We're now in a fulsome debate on that, and I'm afraid Facebook has come down to the position trying to carve out exceptions to that. I hope you'll fill me in on how that is consistent with protecting privacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you for being here today, Mr. Zuckerberg. You have told us today, and you've told the world, that Facebook was deceived by Alexander Kogan when he sold user information to Cambridge Analytica, correct?
Yes.
I want to show you the terms of service that Alexander Kogan provided to Facebook. And note for you that, in fact, Facebook was on notice that he could sell that user information. Have you seen these terms of service before?
I have not.
Who in Facebook was responsible for seeing those terms of service that put you on notice that that information could be sold?
Senator, our app review team would be responsible for that.
Has anyone been fired on that app review team?
Senator, not because of this.
Doesn't that term of service conflict with the FTC order that Facebook was under at that very time that this term of service was, in fact, provided to Facebook? And you'll note that the FTC order specifically requires Facebook to protect privacy. Isn't there a conflict there?
Senator, it certainly appears that we should have been aware that this app developer submitted a term that was in conflict with the rules of the platform.
Well, what happened here was, in effect, willful blindness. It was heedless and reckless, which, in fact, amounted to a violation of the FTC consent decree. Would you agree?
No, Senator. My understanding is not that this was a violation of the consent decree, but as I've said a number of times today, I think we need to take a broader view of our responsibility around privacy than just what is mandated in the current laws.
Well, here is my reservation, Mr. Zuckerberg, and I apologize for interrupting you, but my time is limited. We've seen the apology tours before. You have refused to acknowledge even an ethical obligation to have reported this violation of the FTC consent decree. And we have letters, we've had contacts with Facebook employees, and I'm going to submit a letter for the record from Sandy Parakilas, with your permission, that indicates not only a lack of resources, but lack of attention to privacy. And so my reservation about your testimony today is that I don't see how you can change your business model unless there are specific rules of the road. Your business model is to monetize user information, to maximize profit over privacy. And unless there are specific rules and requirements enforced by an outside agency, I have no assurance that these kinds of vague commitments are going to produce action. So I want to ask you a couple of very specific questions, and they are based on legislation that I've offered, the My Data Act, legislation that Senator Markey is introducing today, the Consent Act, which I'm joining. Don't you agree that companies ought to be required to provide users with clear, plain information about how their data will be used and specific ability to consent to the use of that information?
Senator, I do generally agree with what you're saying, and I laid that out earlier when I talked about what...
Would you agree to an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out?
Senator, I think that certainly makes sense to discuss, and I think the details around this matter a lot.
Would you agree that users should be able to access all of their information?
Senator, yes, of course.
All of the information that you collect as a result of purchases from data brokers, as well as tracking them?
Senator, we have already a download your information tool that allows people to see and to take out all of the information that they've put into Facebook or that Facebook knows about them. So yes, I agree with that. We already have that.
I have a number of other specific requests that you agree to support as part of legislation. I think legislation is necessary. The rules of the road have to be the result of congressional action. Facebook has participated recently in the fight against the scourge of sex trafficking, and the bill that we've just passed, it will be signed into law tomorrow. SESTA, the Stop Exploiting Sex Trafficking Act, was the result of our cooperation. I hope that we can cooperate on this kind of measure as well.
Senator, I look forward to having my team work with you on this.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, welcome. Thank you for being here. Mr. Zuckerberg, does Facebook consider itself a neutral public forum?
Senator, we consider ourselves to be a platform for all ideas.
Let me ask the question again. Does Facebook consider itself to be a neutral public forum? And representatives of your company have given conflicting answers on this. Are you a First Amendment speaker expressing your views, or are you a neutral public forum allowing everyone to speak?
Senator, here's how we think about this. I don't believe that there is certain content that clearly we do not allow, right? Hate speech, terrorist content, nudity, anything that makes people feel unsafe in the community. From that perspective, that's why we generally try to refer to what we do as a platform for all ideas.
Let me try, just because the time is constrained. It's just a simple question. The predicate for Section 230 immunity under the CDA is that you are a neutral public forum. Do you consider yourself a neutral public forum, or are you engaged in political speech, which is your right under the First Amendment?
Well, Senator, our goal is certainly not to engage in political speech. I'm not that familiar with the specific legal language of the law that you speak to, so I would need to follow up with you on that. I'm just trying to lay out how broadly I think about this.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, I will say there are a great many Americans who I think are deeply concerned that Facebook and other tech companies are engaged in a pervasive pattern of bias and political censorship. There have been numerous instances with Facebook In May of 2016, Gizmodo reported that Facebook had purposely and routinely suppressed conservative stories from trending news, including stories about CPAC, including stories about Mitt Romney, including stories about the Lois Lerner IRS scandal, including stories about Glenn Beck. In addition to that, Facebook has initially shut down the Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day page, has blocked a post of a Fox News reporter, has blocked over 24 Catholic pages, and most recently blocked Trump supporters Diamond and Silk's page with 1.2 million Facebook followers after determining their content and brand were, quote, unsafe to the community. To a great many Americans, that appears to be a pervasive pattern of political bias. Do you agree with that assessment?
Senator, let me say a few things about this. First, I understand where that concern is coming from because Facebook and the tech industry are located in Silicon Valley, which is an extremely left-leaning place. And this is actually a concern that I have and that I try to root out at the company, is making sure that we don't have any bias in the work that we do. And I think it is a fair concern that that people would at least wonder about.
Let me ask this
Now,
question. Are you aware of any ad or page that has been taken down from Planned Parenthood?
Senator, I'm not, but let me just...
How about MoveOn.org?
Sorry?
How about MoveOn.org?
I'm not specifically aware of those.
How about
cases.
any Democratic candidate for office?
I'm not specifically aware. I mean, I'm not sure.
In your testimony, you say that you have 15,000 to 20,000 people working on security and content review. Do you know the political orientation of those 15,000 to 20,000 people engaged in content review?
No, Senator. We do not generally ask people about their political orientation when they're joining the company.
So as CEO, have you ever made hiring or firing decisions based on political positions or what candidates they supported?
No.
Why was Palmer Luckey fired?
That is a specific personnel matter that seems like it would be inappropriate to
You
speak
just made
to
a
here.
specific representation that you didn't make decisions based on political views.
Well,
Is that accurate?
I can commit that it was not because of a political view.
Do you know of those 15,000 to 20,000 people engaged in content review, how many, if any, have ever supported financially a Republican candidate for office?
Senator, I do not know that.
Your testimony says it is not enough that we just connect people. We have to make sure those connections are positive. It says we have to make sure people aren't using their voice to hurt people or spread misinformation. We have a responsibility not just to build tools, to make sure those tools are used for good. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you feel it's your responsibility to assess users whether they are good and positive connections or ones that those 15,000 to 20,000 people deem unacceptable or deplorable?
Senator, you're asking about me personally?
Facebook.
Senator, I think that there are a number of things that we would all agree are clearly bad. Foreign interference in our elections, terrorism, self-harm.
I'm
Those
talking
are
about
things.
censorship.
Well, I think that you would probably agree that we should remove terrorist propaganda from the service. So that, I agree, I think is clearly bad activity that we want to get down, and we're generally proud of how well we do at that. Now, what I can say, and I do want to get this in before the end here, is that I am very committed to making sure that Facebook is a platform for all ideas. That is a very important founding principle of what we do. We're proud of the discourse and the different ideas that people can share on the service, and that is something that, as long as I'm running the company, I'm going to be committed to making sure is the case.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz.
Before I call on Senator Whitehouse, Senator Feinstein asked permission to put letters and statements in the record, and without objection, they will be put in from the ACLU, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Association for Computing Machinery Public Policy Council, and Public Knowledge. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to correct one thing that I said earlier in response to a question from Senator Leahy. He had asked if why we didn't ban Cambridge Analytica at the time when we learned about them in 2015, and I answered that what my understanding was that they were not on the platform, were not a app developer or advertiser. when I went back and met with my team afterwards, they let me know that Cambridge Analytica actually did start as an advertiser later in 2015. So we could have, in theory, banned them then. We made a mistake by not doing so, but I just wanted to make sure that I updated that, and because I misspoke or got that wrong earlier.
White House.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome back, Mr. Zuckerberg. On the subject of bans, I just wanted to explore a little bit what these bans mean. Obviously, Facebook has been done considerable reputational damage by its association with Alexander Kogan and with Cambridge Analytica, which is one of the reasons you're having this enjoyable afternoon with us. Your testimony says that Alexander Kogan's app has been banned. Has he also been banned?
Yes, my understanding is he has.
So if he were to open up another account under a name and you were able to find it out, that would be taken, that would be closed down.
Senator, I believe we are preventing him from building any more apps.
Does he have a Facebook account still?
Senator, I believe the answer to that is no, but I can follow up with you afterwards.
Okay. And with respect to Cambridge Analytica, your testimony is that first you required them to formally certify that they had deleted all improperly acquired data. Where did that formal certification take place? That sounds kind of like a quasi-official thing to formally certify. What did that entail?
Senator, first, they sent us an email notice from their chief data officer telling us that they didn't have any of the data anymore, that they deleted it and weren't using it. And then later, we followed up with, I believe, a full legal contract where they certified that they had deleted the data.
In a legal contract?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And then you ultimately said that you have banned Cambridge Analytica. Who exactly is banned? What if they opened up Cranston, Rhode Island Analytica? Different corporate form, same enterprise. Would that enterprise also be banned?
Senator, that is certainly the intent. Cambridge Analytica actually has a parent company, and we banned the parent company. And recently, we also banned a firm called AIQ, which I think is also associated with them. And if we find other firms that are associated with them, we will block them from the platform as well.
Are individual principals, PALS, principals of the firm also banned?
Senator, my understanding is we're blocking them from doing business on the platform, but I do not believe that we're blocking people's personal accounts.
Okay. Can any customer amend your terms of service? Or is the terms of service a take it or leave it proposition for the average customer?
Senator, I think the terms of service are what they are, but the service is really defined by people because you get to choose what information you share. And the whole service is about which friends you connect to, which people you choose to connect to.
My question would relate to Senator Graham held up that big fat document. It's easy to put a lot of things buried in a document that then later turn out to be of consequence. And all I wanted to establish with you is that that document that Senator Graham held up, that is not a negotiable thing with individual customers. That is a take it or leave it proposition for your customers to sign up to or not use the service.
Senator, that's right on the terms of service, although we offer a lot of controls so people can configure the experience how they want.
So last question on a different subject having to do with the authorization process that you are undertaking for entities that are putting up political content or so-called issue ad content. You've said that they'll have to go through an authorization process before they do it. You said here, we will be verifying the identity. How do you look behind a shell corporation and find who's really behind it through your authorization process? Well, step back. Do you need to look behind shell corporations in order to find out who is really behind the content that's being posted? And if you may need to look behind a shell corporation, how will you go about doing that? How will you get back to the true, what lawyers would call beneficial owner of the site that is putting out the political material?
Senator, are you referring to the verification of political and issue ads?
Yes. And before that, political ads, yes.
Yes. So what we're going to do is require a valid government identity, and we're going to verify the location. So we're going to do that so that way someone sitting in Russia, for example, couldn't say that they're in America and therefore able to run an election ad.
But if they were running through a corporation domiciled in Delaware, you wouldn't know that they were actually a Russian owner.
Senator, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired, and I appreciate the courtesy of the chair for the extra seconds. Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, I wanted to follow up on a statement that you made shortly before the break, just a few minutes ago. You said that there are some categories of speech, some types of content that Facebook would never want to have any part of, and takes active steps to avoid disseminating, including hate speech, nudity, racist speech. I assume you also meant terrorist acts, threats of physical violence, things like that. Beyond that, would you agree that Facebook ought not be putting its thumb on the scale with regard to the content of speech, assuming it fits out of one of those categories that's prohibited?
Senator, yes. There are generally two categories of content that we're very worried about. One are things that could cause real-world harm. So terrorism certainly fits into that. Self-harm fits into that. I would consider election interference to fit into that. And those are the types of things that I don't really consider there to be much discussion around whether those are good or bad topics.
Yeah, and I'm not disputing that. What I'm asking is, once you get beyond those categories of things that are prohibited and should be, is it Facebook's position that it should not be putting its thumb on the scale? It should not be favoring or disfavoring speech based on its content, based on the viewpoint of that speech?
Senator, in general, that's our position. One of the things that is really important, though, is that in order to create a service where everyone has a voice, we also need to make sure that people aren't bullied or basically intimidated or the environment feels unsafe for them.
Okay. So when you say in general, that's the exception that you're referring to. The exception being that if someone feels bullied, even if it's not a terrorist act, nudity, terrorist threats, racist speech, or something like that, you might step in there. Beyond that, would you step in and put your thumb on the scale as far as the viewpoint of the content being posted?
Senator, no. I mean, in general, our goal is to allow people to have as much expression as possible.
Okay, so subject to the exceptions we've discussed, you would stay out of that. Let me ask you this. Isn't there a significant free market incentive that a social media company, including yours, has in order to safeguard the data of your users? Don't you have free market incentives? And in that respect,
Senator, yes.
Don't your interests align with those of us here who want to see data safeguarded?
Absolutely.
Do you have the technological means available at your disposal to make sure that that doesn't happen and to protect, say, an app developer from transferring Facebook data to a third party?
Senator, a lot of that we do, and some of that happens outside of our systems and will require new measures. So, for example, what we saw here was people chose to share information with an app developer. That worked according to how the system was designed. That information was then transferred out of our system to servers that this developer, Alexander Kogan, had, and then that person chose to then go sell the data to Cambridge Analytica. That is going to require much more active intervention and auditing from us to prevent going forward, because once it's out of our system, it is a lot harder for us to have a full understanding of what's happening.
From what you've said today and from previous statements made by you and other officials at your company, data is at the center of your business model. It's how you make money. Your ability to run your business effectively, given that you don't charge your users, is based on monetizing data. And so the real issue, it seems to me, really comes down to what you tell the public, what you tell users of Facebook about what you're going to do with the data, about how you're going to use it. Can you give me a couple of examples, maybe 2 examples of ways in which data is collected by Facebook in a way that people are not aware of? 2 examples of types of data that Facebook collects that might be surprising to Facebook users.
Well, Senator, I would hope that what we do with data is not surprising to people.
And has it been at times?
Well, Senator, I think in this case, people certainly didn't expect this developer to sell the data to Cambridge Analytica. In general, there are 2 types of data that Facebook has. The vast majority, and then the first category, is content that people chose to share on the service themselves. So that's all the photos that you share, the posts that you make, what you think of as the Facebook service, right? Everyone has control every single time that they go to share that. They can delete that data anytime they want. Full control, the majority of the data. The second category is around specific data that we collect in order to make the advertising experiences better and more relevant and work for businesses. And those often revolve around measuring, okay, if we showed you an ad and then you click through and you go somewhere else, we can measure that you actually, that the ad worked. That helps make the experience more relevant and better for people who are getting more relevant ads, and better for the businesses because they perform better. You also have control completely of that second type of data. You can turn off the ability for Facebook to collect that. Your ads will get worse, so a lot of people don't want to do that. But you have complete control over what you do there as well.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on the questions around the terms of service. Your terms of service are about 3,200 words with 30 links. One of the links is to your data policy, which is about 2,700 words with 22 links. And I think the point has been well made that people really have no earthly idea what they're signing up for. And I understand that at the present time that's legally binding, but I'm wondering if you can explain to the billions of users in plain language, what are they signing up for?
Senator, that's a good and important question here. In general, you sign up for the Facebook. You get the ability to share the information that you want with people. That's what the service is, right? Is that you can connect with the people that you want, and you can share whatever content matters to you, whether that's photos or links or posts. And you get control over who you share it with, and you can take it down if you want, and you don't need to put anything up in the first place if you don't want.
What about the part that people are worried about, not the fun part?
Well, what's that?
The part that people are worried about is that the data is going to be improperly used. So people are trying to figure out, are your DMs informing the ads? Are your browsing habits being collected? Everybody kind of understands that when you click like on something, or if you say you like a certain movie or have a particular political proclivity, that I think that's fair game. Everybody understands that. What we don't understand exactly, because both as a matter of practice and as a matter of not being able to decipher those terms of service and the privacy policy, is what exactly are you doing with the data, and do you draw a distinction between data collected in the process of utilizing the platform and that which we clearly volunteer to the public to present ourselves to other Facebook users?
Senator, I'm not sure I fully understand this. In general, people come to Facebook to share content with other people. We use that in order to also inform how we rank services like newsfeed and ads to provide more relevant experiences.
Let me try a couple of specific examples. If I'm emailing within WhatsApp, does that ever inform your advertisers?
No, we don't see any of the content in WhatsApp. It's fully encrypted.
Right, but is there some algorithm that spits out some information to your ad platform, and then let's say I'm emailing about Black Panther within WhatsApp. Do I get a Black Panther banner ad?
Senator, Facebook systems do not see the content of messages being transferred over WhatsApp.
Yeah, I know, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking about whether these systems talk to each other without a human being touching it.
Senator, I think the answer to your specific question is if you message someone about Black Panther in WhatsApp, it would not inform any ads.
Okay. I want to follow up on Senator Nelson's original question, which is the question of ownership of the data. And I understand as a sort of matter of principle, you're saying, you know, we want our customers to have more rather than less control over the data. But I can't imagine that it's true as a legal matter that I actually own my Facebook data because you're the one monetizing it. Do you want to modify that to sort of express that as a statement of principle, a sort of aspirational goal? But it doesn't seem to me that we own our own data, otherwise we'd be getting a cut.
Well, Senator, you own it in the sense that you choose to put it there, you could take it down any time, and you completely control the terms under which it's used. When you put it on Facebook, you are granting us a license to be able to show it to other people. I mean, that's necessary in order for the service to operate.
Right, but so your definition of ownership is I sign up, I voluntarily, and I may delete my account if I wish, but that's basically it.
Well, Senator, I think that the control is much more granular than that. You can choose each photo that you want to put up or each message, and you can delete those. And you don't need to delete your whole account. You have specific control. You can share different posts with different people.
In the time I have left, I want to propose something to you and take it for the record. I read an interesting article this week by Professor Jack Balkin at Yale that proposes a concept of an information fiduciary. People think of fiduciaries as responsible primarily in the economic sense, but this is really about a trust relationship, like doctors and lawyers. Tech companies should hold in trust our personal data. Are you open to the idea of a information fiduciary enshrined in statute?
Senator, I think it's certainly an interesting idea, and Jack is very thoughtful in this space, so I do think it deserves consideration.
Thank you.
The whole reason we're having this hearing is because of a tension between two basic principles you've laid out. First, you've said about the data that users post on Facebook, you control and own the data that you put on Facebook. You've said some very positive, optimistic things about privacy and data ownership. But it's also the reality that Facebook is a for-profit entity that generated $40 billion in ad revenue last year by targeting ads. In fact, Facebook claims that advertising makes it easy to find the right people, capture their attention, and get results, and you recognize that an ad-supported service is, as you said earlier today, best aligned with your mission and values. But the reality is there's a lot of examples where ad targeting has led to results that I think we would all disagree with or dislike or would concern us. You've already admitted that Facebook's own ad tools allowed Russians to target users, voters, based on racist or anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant views, and that may have played a significant role in an election here in the United States. Just today, Time magazine posted a story saying that wildlife traffickers are continuing to use Facebook tools to advertise illegal sales of protected animal parts. And I am left questioning whether your ad targeting tools would allow other concerning practices like diet pill manufacturers targeting teenagers who are struggling with their weight, or allowing a liquor distributor to target alcoholics, or a gambling organization to target those with gambling problems. I'll give you one concrete example I'm sure you're familiar with. ProPublica back in 2016 highlighted that Facebook lets advertisers exclude users by race in real estate advertising. There was a way that you could say that this particular ad, I only want to be seen by white folks, not by people of color, and that clearly violates fair housing laws and our basic sense of fairness in the United States. And you promptly announced that that was a bad idea, you were going to change the tools, and that you would build a new system to spot and reject discriminatory ads that violate our commitment to fair housing. And yet a year later, a follow-up story by ProPublica said that those changes hadn't fully been made, and it was still possible to target housing advertisement in a way that was racially discriminatory. And my concern is that this practice of making bold and engaging promises about changes in practices and then the reality of how Facebook has operated in the real world are in persistent tension. Several different senators have asked earlier today about the 2011 FTC consent decree that required Facebook to better protect users' privacy. And there are a whole series of examples where there have been things brought to your attention, where Facebook has apologized and has said we're going to change our practices and our policies, and yet there doesn't seem to have been as much follow-up as would be called for. At the end of the day, policies aren't worth the paper they're written on if Facebook doesn't enforce them? And I'll close with a question that's really rooted in an experience I had today as an avid Facebook user. I woke up this morning and was notified by a whole group of friends across the country asking if I had a new family or if there was a fake Facebook post of Chris Coons. I went to the one they suggested. It had a different middle initial than mine. And there's my picture with Senator Dan Sullivan's family. Same schools I went to, but a whole lot of Russian friends. Dan Sullivan's got a very attractive family, by the way. And
keep that for the record there, Mr. Chairman.
the friends who brought this to my attention included people I went to law school with in Hawaii and our own Attorney General in the state of Delaware. And fortunately, I've got, great folks who work in my office. I brought it to their attention. They pushed Facebook, and it was taken down by midday. But I'm left worried about what happens to Delawareans who don't have these resources. It's still possible to find Russian trolls operating on the platform. Hate groups thrive in some areas of Facebook, even though your policies prohibit hate speech and you've taken strong steps against extremism and terrorists. But is a Delawarean who's not in the Senate going to get the same sort of quick response? I've already gotten input from other friends who say they've had trouble getting a positive response when they've brought to Facebook's attention a page that's, frankly, clearly violative of your basic principles. My core question is, isn't it Facebook's job to better protect its users? And why do you shift the burden to users to flag inappropriate content and make sure it's taken down?
Senator, there are a number of important points in there, and I think it's clear that this is an area, content policy enforcement, that we need to do a lot better on over time. The history of how we got here is we started off in my dorm room with not a lot of resources and not having the AI technology to be able to proactively identify a lot of this stuff. So just because of the sheer volume of content, the main way that this works today is that people report things to us, and then we have our team review that. And as I said before, by the end of this year, we're going to have more than 20,000 people at the company working on security and content review because this is important. Over time, we're going to shift increasingly to a method where more of this content is flagged upfront by AI tools that we develop. We've prioritized the most important types of content that we can build AI tools for today, like terror-related content, where I mentioned earlier that our systems that we deploy, I think, are taking down 99% of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda related content that we take down before a person even flags them to us. If we fast forward 5 or 10 years, I think we're going to have more AI technology that can do that in more areas. And I think we need to get there as soon as possible, which is why we're investing in that.
I couldn't agree more. I just think we can't wait 5 years to get housing discrimination and personally offensive material out of Facebook. Thank you,
I agree.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, thanks for being here. At current pace, you're due to be done with first round of questioning by about 1 a.m., so congratulations. I like Chris Coons a lot, with his own family or with Dan Sullivan's family. Both are great photos. But I want to ask a similar set of questions from the other side, maybe. I think the conceptual line between mere tech company, mere tools, and an actual content company, I think it's really hard. I think you guys have a hard challenge. I think regulation over time will have a hard challenge. And you're a private company, so you can make policies that may be less than First Amendment full spirit embracing, in my view, but I worry about that. I worry about a world where when you go from violent groups to hate speech in a hurry, in one of your responses to one of the opening questions, you may decide, or Facebook may decide, it needs to police a whole bunch of speech that I think America might be better off not having policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. Can you define hate speech?
Senator, I think that this is a really hard question, and I think it's one of the reasons why we struggle with it. There are certain definitions that we have around, calling for violence or.
Let's just agree on that. If somebody's calling for violence, that shouldn't be there. I'm worried about the psychological categories around speech. You used language of safety and protection earlier. We see this happening on college campuses all across the country. It's dangerous. 40% of Americans under age 35 tell pollsters they think the First Amendment is dangerous because you might use your freedom to say something that hurts somebody else's feelings. Guess what? There are some really passionately held views about the abortion issue on this panel today. Can you imagine a world where you might decide that pro-lifers are prohibited from speaking about their abortion views on your content, on your platform?
I certainly would not want that to be the case.
But it might really be unsettling to people who've had an abortion to have an open debate about that, wouldn't it?
It might be, but I don't think that that would fit any of the definitions of what we have. But I do generally agree with the point that you're making, which is as we're able to technologically shift towards especially having AI proactively look at content, I think that that's going to create massive questions for society about what obligations we want to require companies to fulfill. And I do think that that's a question that we need to struggle with as a country, because I know other countries are, and they're putting laws in place. And I think that America needs to figure out and create the set of principles that we want American companies to operate under.
Thanks. I wouldn't want you to leave here today and think there's sort of a unified view in the Congress that you should be moving toward policing more and more and more speech. I think violence has no place on your platform. Sex traffickers and human traffickers have no place on your platform. But vigorous debates, adults need to engage in vigorous debates. I have only a little less than 2 minutes left, so I want to shift gears a little bit. But that was about adults. You're a dad. I'd like to talk a little bit about social media addiction. You started your comments today by talking about how Facebook is and was founded as an optimistic company. You and I have had conversations separate from here. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think as you've aged, you might be a little bit less idealistic and optimistic than you were when you started Facebook. As a dad, do you worry about social media addiction as a problem for America's teens?
Well, my hope is that we can be idealistic but have a broad view of our responsibility. To your point about teens, this is certainly something that I think any parent thinks about, is how much do you want your kids using technology? At Facebook specifically, I view our responsibility as not just building services that people like, but building services that are good for people and good for society as well. So we study a lot of effects of well-being of our tools and broader technology. And like any tool, there are good and bad uses of it. What we find in general is that if you're using social media in order to build relationships, right? So you're sharing content with friends, you're interacting, then that is associated with all of the long-term measures of well-being that you would intuitively think of. Long-term health, long-term happiness, long-term feeling connected, feeling less lonely. But if you're using the internet and social media primarily to just passively consume content and you're not engaging with other people, then it doesn't have those positive effects and it could be negative.
We're almost at time, so I want to ask you one more. Do social media companies hire consulting firms to help them figure out how to get more dopamine feedback loops so that people don't want to leave the platform?
No, Senator. That's not how we talk about this or how we set up our product teams. We want our products to be valuable to people, and if they're valuable, then people choose to use them.
Are you aware of other social media companies that do hire such consultants?
Not sitting here today.
Thanks.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to Senator Blumenthal's pointed questions, you refused to answer whether Facebook should be required by law to obtain clear permission from users before selling or sharing their personal information. So I'm going to ask it one more time. Yes or no? Should Facebook get clear permission from users before selling or sharing sensitive information about your health, your finances, your relationships? Should you have to get their permission? That's essentially the consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission that you signed in 2011. Should you have to get permission? Should the consumer have to opt in?
Senator, we do require permission to use the system and to put information in there and for all the uses of it. I want to be clear, we don't sell information. So regardless of whether we could get permission to do that, that's just not a thing that we're going to go do.
So would you support legislation? I have a bill, Senator Blumenthal referred to it, the Consent Act, that would just put on the books a law that said that Facebook and any other company that gathers information about Americans
has to get their permission, their affirmative permission, before it can be reused for other purposes. Would you support that legislation to make it a national standard for not just Facebook, but for all the other companies out there, some of them bad actors? Would you support that legislation?
Senator, in general, I think that that principle is exactly right, and I think we should have a discussion around how to best
No, but would
codify
you
that.
support legislation to back that general principle, that opt-in, that getting permission is the standard? Would you support legislation to make that the American standard? Europeans have passed that as a law. Facebook's going to live with that law beginning on May 25th. Would you support that as the law in the United States?
Senator, as a principle, yes, I would. I think the details matter a lot.
Right,
and
but
now that-
assuming that we work out the details, you do support opt-in as the standard, getting permission affirmatively as the standard for the United States. Is that correct?
Senator, I think that that's the right principle. And 100 billion times a day in our services, when people go to share content, they choose who they want to share
So
it affirmatively.
you could support a law that enshrines that as the promise that we make to the American people, that permission has to be obtained before their information is used. Is that correct?
Senator, yes,
Okay.
I've said that in principle. I think that that makes sense,
Okay.
and the details matter. And I look forward to having our team work with you on fleshing that out.
Right. So the next subject, because I want to, again, I want to make sure that we kind of drill down here. You earlier made reference to the Child Online Privacy Protection Act of 1999, which I am the author of. So that is the Constitution for child privacy protection online in the country, and I'm very proud of that. But there are no protections additionally for a 13, a 14, or a 15-year-old. They get the same protections that a 30-year-old or a 50-year-old get. So I have a separate piece of legislation to ensure that kids who are under 16 absolutely have a privacy bill of rights, and that permission has to be received from their parents or the children before any of their information is reused for any other purpose other than that which was originally intended. Would you support a child online privacy bill of rights for kids under 16 to guarantee that that information is not reused for any other purpose without explicit permission from the parents or the kids?
Senator, I think as a general principle, I think protecting minors and protecting their privacy is extremely important. And we do a number of things on Facebook to do that already, which I'm happy to get into.
And I
if
appreciate it.
that's
I'm
helpful.
talking about a law. I'm talking about a law. Would you support a law to ensure that kids under 16 have this privacy bill of rights? I had this conversation with you in your office 7 years ago about this specific subject in Palo Alto. And I think that's really what the American people want to know right now. What is the protections of this? What are the protections that are going to be put on the books for their families, but especially for their children? Would you support a privacy bill of rights for kids where opt-in is the standard? Yes or no?
Senator, I think that that's an important principle.
I
And
appreciate
think,
that.
And I think we should.
Do we need a law to protect those children? That's my question to you. Do you believe we need a law to do so? Yes or no?
Senator, I'm not sure if we need a law, but I think that this is certainly a thing that deserves a lot of discussion.
And again, I couldn't disagree with you more. We're leaving these children to the most rapacious commercial predators in the country who will exploit these children unless we absolutely have a law on the books. And I
Senator,
think it is absolutely imperative.
Please give a short answer.
Senator, I look forward to having my team follow up to flesh out the details of it.
I don't think this is a
Senator
difficult
Flake, Senator
issue
Flake.
to get a correct answer.
Thank you.
Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has proposed a new extreme vetting initiative, which they have renamed Visa Life Cycle Vetting. That sounds less scary. They have already held an industry day that they advertised on the federal contracting website to get input from tech companies on the best way to, among other things, and I'm quoting ICE, exploit publicly available information such as media, blogs, public hearings, conferences, academic websites, social media websites such as Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to extract pertinent information regarding targets. And basically what they want to do with these targets is to determine, and again, I'm quoting the ICE's own document, they want, ICE has been directed to develop processes that determine and evaluate an applicant's, i.e. target's probability of becoming a positively contributing member of society, as well as their ability to contribute to national interest in order to meet the executive order, that is the president's executive order. And then ICE must also develop a mechanism or methodology that allows them to assess whether an applicant intends to commit criminal or terrorist acts after entering the United States. The question to you is, does Facebook plan to cooperate with this extreme vetting initiative and help the Trump administration target people for deportation or other ICE enforcement?
Senator, I don't know that we've had specific conversations around that. In general,
Well, if you were asked to provide or cooperate with ICE so that they could determine whether somebody's going to commit a crime, for example, or become fruitful members of our society, would you cooperate?
we would
with
not
them?
proactively do that. We cooperate with law enforcement in two cases. One is if we become aware of an imminent threat of harm, then we will proactively reach out to law enforcement, as we believe is our responsibility to do. The other is when law enforcement reaches out to us with a valid legal subpoena or request for data. In those cases, if their request is overly broad or we believe it's not a legal request, then we're going to push back aggressively.
Well, let's assume that ICE doesn't have a law, there's no law or rule that requires that Facebook cooperate to allow them to get this kind of information so that they can make those kinds of assessments. It sounds to me as though you would decline.
Senator, that is correct.
Is there some way that, well, I know that you determine what kind of content would be deemed harmful. So do you believe that ICE can even do what they are talking about, namely through a combination of various kinds of information, including information that they would hope to obtain from entities such as yours, predict who will commit crimes or present a national security problem? Do you think that that's even doable?
Senator, I'm not familiar enough with what they're doing to offer an informed opinion on that.
Well, you have to make assessments as to what constitutes hate speech. That's pretty hard to do. You have to assess what election interference is. So these are rather difficult to identify, but wouldn't trying to predict whether somebody's going to commit a crime fit into the category of pretty difficult to assess?
Senator, it sounds difficult to me. All of these things, like you're saying, are difficult.
Well,
I don't know, without having worked on it or thinking about it, how
I
much
think common
progress
sense
one
would
could make.
tell us that that's pretty difficult, and yet that's what ICE is proceeding to do. You were asked about discriminatory advertising, and in February of 2017, Facebook announced that it would no longer allow certain kinds of ads that discriminated on the basis of race, gender, family status, sexual orientation, disability, or veteran status, all categories prohibited by federal law and housing. And yet, after 2017, it was discovered that you could, in fact, place those kinds of ads. So what is the status of whether or not these ads can currently be placed on Facebook? And have you followed through on your February 2017 promise to address this problem? And is there a way for the public to verify that you have, or are we just expected to trust that you've done this?
Senator, those are all important questions. And in general, it is against our policies to have any ads that are discriminatory.
Well, you said that you wouldn't allow it, but then, what is it, ProPublica could place these ads even after you said you would no longer allow these kinds of ads. So what assurance do we have from you that this is going to stop?
Well, two things. One is that we've removed the ability to exclude ethnic groups and other sensitive categories from ad targeting. So that just isn't a feature that's even available anymore. For some of these cases where it may make sense to target proactively a group, the enforcement today is still, we review ads, we screen them up front, but most of the enforcement today is still that our community flags issues for us when they come up. So if the community flags that issue for us, then our team, which has thousands of people working on it, should take it down. We'll make some mistakes, but we try to make as few as possible. Over time, I think the strategy would be to develop more AI tools that can more proactively identify those types of content and do that filtering up front.
So
Thank
it's
you.
a work in progress.
Thank you, Senator
That's what it
Verono.
sounds
Senator
like.
Sullivan's
Thank
up
you.
next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Zuckerberg, quite a story, right? Dorm room to the global behemoth that you guys are, only in America. Would you agree with that?
Senator, mostly in America.
You couldn't do this in China, right? Or what you did
Well,
in 10 years.
Well, Senator, there are some very strong Chinese internet companies.
Right, but you're supposed to answer yes to this question. Okay, come on, I'm trying to help you, right? I mean, give me a break. You're in front of a bunch of, the answer is yes, okay? So thank you. Now, your testimony, you have talked about a lot of power. You've been involved in elections. I thought your testimony was very interesting, really all over the world. The Facebook, 2 billion users, over 200 million Americans, 40 billion in revenue. I believe you and Google have almost 75% of the digital advertising in the U.S. One of the key issues here is Facebook too powerful? Are you too powerful? And do you think you're too powerful?
Well, Senator, I think most of the time when people talk about our scale, they're referencing that we have 2 billion people in our community. And I think one of the big questions that we need to think through here is the vast majority of those 2 billion people are outside of the U.S. And I think that that's something that, to your point, that Americans should be proud of.
Okay,
and when I brought up the Chinese internet companies, I think that that's a real strategic and competitive threat that in American technology policy we should be thinking about.
Let me get to another point here real quick. I don't want to interrupt, but you know, when you look at kind of the history of this country and you look at the history of these kind of hearings, right? You're a smart guy, you read a lot of history. When companies become big and powerful and accumulate a lot of wealth and power, what typically happens from this body is there's a instinct to either regulate or break up, right? Look at the history of this nation. You have any thoughts on those two policy approaches?
Well, Senator, I'm not the type of person who thinks that all regulation is bad. So I think the internet is becoming increasingly important in people's lives, and I think we need to have a full conversation about what is the right regulation, not whether it should be or shouldn't be.
Let me talk about the tension there, because I think it's a good point, and I appreciate you mentioning that. You know, one of my worries on regulation, again, with a company of your size, you're saying, hey, we might be interested in being regulated, but as you know, regulations can also cement the dominant power. So what do I mean by that? You know, you have a lot of lobbyists. I think every lobbyist in town is involved in this hearing in some way or another, a lot of powerful interests. You look at what happened with Dodd-Frank. That was supposed to be aimed at the big banks. The regulations ended up empowering the big banks and keeping the small banks down. Do you think that that's a risk, given your influence, that if we regulate, we're actually going to regulate into you into a position of cemented authority, when one of my biggest concerns about what you guys are doing is that the next Facebook, which we all want, the guy in the dorm room, we all want that to start it, that you are becoming so dominant that we're not able to have that next Facebook. What are your views on that?
Well, Senator, I agree with the point that when you're thinking through regulation, across all industries, you need to be careful that it doesn't cement in the current companies that are winning.
But would you try to do that? Isn't that the normal inclination of a company to say, hey, I'm going to hire the best guys in town and I'm going to cement in an advantage? You wouldn't do that if we were regulating you?
Senator, that certainly wouldn't be our approach.
wouldn't?
But I think part of the challenge with regulation in general is that when you add more rules that companies need to follow, that's something that a larger company like ours inherently just has the resources to go do, and that might just be harder for a smaller company getting started to be able to comply with.
Correct.
So it's not something that, like, going into this, I would look at the conversation as what is the right outcome. I think there are real challenges that we face around content and privacy and in a number of other areas, ads transparency, elections.
Let me get, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me get to one final question that kind of relates to what you're talking about in terms of content, regulation, and what exactly Facebook is. You know, you mentioned you're a tech company, a platform, but there's some who are saying that you're the world's biggest publisher. I think about 140 million Americans get their news from Facebook, and when you mentioned to Senator Cornyn, you said you are responsible for your content. So which are you? Are you a tech company, or are you the world's largest publisher? Because I think that goes to a really important question on what form of regulation or government action, if any, we would take.
Senator, this is a really big question. I view us as a tech company because the primary thing that we do is build technology and products.
But you said you're responsible for your content, which makes
Exactly.
you kind of a publisher, right?
Well, I agree that we're responsible for the content, but we don't produce the content. I think that when people ask us if we're a media company or a publisher, my understanding of what the heart of what they're really getting at is, do we feel a responsibility for the content on our platform? The answer to that, I think, is clearly yes. But I don't think that that's incompatible with fundamentally at our core being a technology company where the main thing that we do is have engineers and build products.
Thank you.
Senator Zuckerberg, thank you for your, I'm over here, thank you for your testimony and thank you for your presence here today. On March the 26th of this year, the FTC confirmed that it was investigating Facebook to determine whether its privacy practices violated the FTC Act or the consent order that Facebook entered into with the agency in 2011. I chair the Commerce Committee subcommittee that has jurisdiction over the Federal Trade Commission. I remain interested in Facebook's assertion that it rejects any suggestion of violating that consent order. Part 2 of that consent order requires that Facebook, quote, clearly and prominently display notice and obtain users' affirmative consent before sharing their information with, quote, any third party. My question is, how does the case of approximately 87 million Facebook friends having their data shared with a third party due to the consent of only 300,000 consenting users not violate that agreement?
Well, Senator, like I said earlier, I mean, our view is that we believe that we are in compliance with the consent order, but I think that we have a broader responsibility to protect people's privacy even beyond that. And in this specific case, the way that the platform worked, or that you could sign into an app and bring some of your information and some of your friends' information, is how we explained it would work. People had settings to that effect. We explained and they consented to it working that way. And the system basically worked as it was designed. The issue is that we designed the system in a way that wasn't good. And now we, starting in 2014, have changed the design of the system so that way it just massively restricts the amount of data access that a developer could get. Going forward,
I'm sorry, the 300,000 people, they were treated in a way that was appropriate. They consented, but you're not suggesting that the friends consented.
Senator, I believe that we rolled out this developer platform and that we explained to people how it worked and that they did consent to it. It makes sense, I think, to go through the way the platform works. I mean, it's in 2007, we announced the Facebook developer platform, and the idea was that you wanted to make more experiences social, right? So, for example, if you might want to have a calendar that can have your friends' birthdays on it, or you might want your address book to have your friends' pictures in it, or you might want a map that can show your friends' addresses on it. In order to do that, we needed to build a tool that allowed people to sign into an app and bring some of their information and some of their friends' information to those apps. We made it very clear that this is how it worked, and when people signed up for Facebook, they signed up for that as well. Now, a lot of good use cases came from that. I mean, there games that were built. There were integrations with companies that I think we're familiar with, like Netflix and Spotify. But over time, what became clear was that that also enabled some abuse. And that's why in 2014, we took the step of changing the platform. So now when people sign into an app, you do not bring some of your friends' information with you. You're only bringing your own information, and you're able to connect with friends who have also authorized that app directly.
Let me turn to your bug bounty program. Our subcommittee has had a hearing in regard to bug bounty. Your press release indicated that was one of the 6 changes that Facebook initially offered to crack down on platform abuses was to reward outside parties who find vulnerabilities. One concern I have regarding the utility of this approach is that the vulnerability disclosure programs are normally geared toward identifying unauthorized access to data, not pointing out data sharing arrangement that likely could harm someone, but technically abide by complex consent agreements. How do you see the bug bounty program that you've announced addressing the issue of that?
Sorry, could you clarify what specific?
How do you see that the bug bounty program that you are and have announced will deal with the sharing of information not permissible as compared to just unauthorized access to data?
Senator, I'm not actually sure I understand this enough to speak to that specific point, and I can have my team follow up with you on the details of that. In general, bounty programs are an important part of the security arsenal for hardening a lot of systems. I think we should expect that we're going to invest a lot in hardening our systems ourselves, and that we're going to audit and investigate a lot of the folks in our ecosystem. But even with that, having the ability to enlist other third parties outside of the company to be able to help us out by giving them an incentive to point out when they see issues, I think is likely going to help us improve the security of the platform overall, which is why we did this.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg.
Chairman, thank you. Appreciate the time, and thank you for being here. I'm over here. Thanks. And thank you for taking time. I know it's been a long day, and I think you're at the final stretch here, but I'm glad that you are here. Yesterday, Facebook sent out a notification to 87 million users that information was given to Cambridge Analytica without their consent. My daughter was one of the 87 million, and 6 of my staff, all from Nevada, received this notification. Can you tell me how many Nevadans were among the 87 million that received this notification?
Senator, I don't have this broken out by state right now, but I can have my team follow up with you to get you the information.
Okay. I figured that would be the answer. If after hearing this, going through this hearing, and Nevadans no longer want to have a Facebook account, if that's the case, if a Facebook user deletes their account, do you delete their data?
Yes.
My kids have been on Facebook and Instagram for years. How long do you keep a user's data?
Sorry,
How long do you keep a user's data once they, after they've left? If they choose to delete their account, how long do you keep their data?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I know we try to delete it as quickly as is reasonable. We have a lot of complex systems, and it takes a while to work through all that. But I think we try to move as quickly as possible, and I can follow up or have my team follow up to get you the data on that.
Okay. Have you ever said that you won't sell an ad based on personal information, simply that you wouldn't sell this data because of the usage of it goes too far?
Senator, could you clarify that?
Have you ever drawn the line on selling data to an advertiser?
Yes, Senator. We don't sell data at all. So the way the ad system works is advertisers can come to us and say, I have a message that I'm trying to reach a certain type of people. They might be interested in something. They might live in a place. And then we help them get that message in front of people. But this is one of it's widely mischaracterized about our system that we sell data. And it's actually one of the most important parts of how Facebook works is we do not sell data. Advertisers do not get access to people's individual data.
Have you ever collected the content of phone calls or messages through any Facebook application or service?
Senator, I don't believe we've ever collected the content of phone calls. We have an app called Messenger that allows people to message their, mostly their Facebook friends. And we do, on the Android operating system, allow people to use that app as their client for both Facebook messages and texts. So we do allow people to import their texts into that.
Okay, let me ask you about government surveillance. For years, Facebook said that there should be strict limits on the information the government can access on Americans. And by the way, I agreed with you that privacy, because privacy is important to Nevadans. You argued that Facebook users wouldn't trust you if they thought you were giving their private information to the intelligence community. Yet you use and sell the same data to make money. And in the case of Cambridge Analytica, you don't even know how it's used after you sell it. Can you tell us why this isn't hypocritical?
Well, Senator, once again, we don't sell any data to anyone. We don't sell it to advertisers, and we don't sell it to developers. What we do allow is for people to sign into apps and bring their data, and it used to be the data of some of their friends, but now it isn't, with them. And that, I think, makes sense. I mean, that's basic data portability, the ability that you own the data, you should be able to take it from one app to another if you'd like.
Do you believe you're more responsible with millions of Americans' personal data than the federal government would be?
Yes. But, Senator, your point about surveillance, I think that there's a very important distinction to draw here, which is that when organizations do surveillance, people don't have control over that. But on Facebook, everything that you share there, you have control over. You can say, I don't want this information to be there. You have full access to understand every piece of information that Facebook might know about you, and you can get rid of all of it. And I don't know of any other any surveillance organization in the world that operates that way, which is why I think that comparison just isn't really apt here.
With you here today, do you think you're a victim?
No.
Do you think Facebook as a company is a victim?
Senator, no. I think we have a responsibility to protect everyone in our community from anyone in our ecosystem who is going to potentially harm them. And I think that we haven't done enough historically, and we need to step up and do more.
Do you consider the 87 million users, do you consider them victims?
Senator, I think, yes. I mean, they did not want their information to be sold to Cambridge Analytica by a developer. And that happened, and it happened on our watch. So even though we didn't do it, I think we have a responsibility to be able to prevent that and be able to take action sooner. And we're committing to make sure that we do that going forward, which is why the steps that I announced before are now, the two most important things that we're doing are locking down the platform to make sure that developers can't get access to that much data so this can't happen again going forward, which I think is largely the case since 2014. And going backwards, we need to investigate every single app that might have had access to a large amount of people's data to make sure that no one else was misusing it. And if we find that they are, we're going to get into their systems, do a full audit, make sure they delete it, and we're going to tell everyone who's affected.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you, Senator Heller. We'll go to Senator Peters and then into the break, and then Senator Tillis coming out of the break. So, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, thank you for being here today. You know, you've talked about your very humble beginnings in starting Facebook in your dorm room, which I appreciated that story, but certainly Facebook has changed an awful lot over a relatively short period of time. When Facebook launched its timeline feature, consumers saw their friends post chronologically, was the process. But Facebook has since then changed to a timeline driven by some very sophisticated algorithms. And I think it has left many people, as a result of that, asking, you know, why am I seeing this feed, and why am I seeing this right now? And now, in light of the Cambridge Analytica issue, Facebook users are asking, I think, some new questions right now. Can I believe what I'm seeing? And who has access to this information about me? So I think it's safe to say, very simply, that Facebook is losing the trust of an awful lot of Americans as a result of this incident. And I think an example of this is something that I've been hearing a lot from folks that have been coming up to me and talking about really kind of an experience they've had where they're having a conversation with friends, not on the phone, just talking, and then they see ads popping up fairly quickly on their Facebook. So I've heard constituents fear that Facebook is mining audio from their mobile devices for the purpose of ad targeting, which I think speaks to this lack of trust that we're seeing here. But and I understand there's some technical issues and logistical issues for that to happen, but for the record, I think it's clear, seeing I hear it all the time, including from my own staff. Yes or no, does Facebook use audio obtained from mobile devices to enrich personal information about its users?
No.
Good.
Well, Senator, let me be clear on this. I mean, so you're talking about this conspiracy theory that gets passed around that we listen to what's going on your microphone and use that for ads.
Right.
We don't do that. To be clear, we do allow people to take videos on their devices and share those. And of course, videos also have audio. So we do, while you're taking a video, record that and use that to make the service better by making sure that your videos have audio. But I mean, that I think is pretty clear, but I just wanted to make sure I was exhaustive there.
Well, I appreciate that. And hopefully that'll dispel a lot of what I've been hearing. So thank you for saying that. Certainly, today, in the era of mega data, we are finding that data drives everything, including consumer behavior. And so consumer information is probably the most valuable information you can get in the data ecosystem. And certainly, folks, as you've mentioned in your testimony here, people like the fact that they can have targeted ads that they're going to be interested in, as opposed to being bombarded by a lot of ads that they don't have any interest in. And that consumer information is important in order for you to tailor that. But also, people are now beginning to wonder, is there an expense to that when it comes to perhaps exposing them to being manipulated or through deception? You've talked about artificial intelligence. You brought that up many times during your testimony. And I know you've employed some new algorithms to target bots, bring down fake accounts, deal with terrorism, things that you've talked about in this hearing. But you also know that artificial intelligence is not without its risk, and that you have to be very transparent about how those algorithms are constructed. How do you see artificial intelligence, more specifically, dealing with the ecosystem by helping to get consumer insights, but also keeping consumer privacy safe?
Senator, I think the core question you're asking about AI transparency is a really important one that people are just starting to very seriously study, and that's ramping up a lot. And I think this is going to be a very central question for how we think about AI systems over the next decade and beyond. Right now, a lot of our AI systems make decisions in ways that people don't really understand.
Right.
And I don't think that in 10 or 20 years in the future that we all want to build, we want to end up with systems that people don't understand how they're making decisions. So doing the research now to make sure that these systems can have those principles as we're developing them, I think is certainly an extremely important thing.
Well, you bring up the principles because, as you're well aware, AI systems, especially in very complex environments when you have machine learning, it's sometimes very difficult to understand, as you mentioned, exactly how those decisions were arrived at. There's examples of how decisions are made on a discriminatory basis, and that it can compound if you're not very careful about how that occurs. And so is your company, you mentioned principles, is your company developing a set of principles that are going to guide that development? And would you provide details to us as to what those principles are and how they will help deal with this issue?
Yes, Senator. I can make sure that our team follows up and gets you the information on that. And we have a whole AI ethics team that is working on developing basically the technology. It's not just about philosophical principles. It's also a technological foundation for making sure that this goes in the direction that we want.
Thank you.
I was Googling earlier, actually going on my Facebook app on my phone earlier, and I found one of your Facebook page, one of your Facebook presences. It was the same one on March 30th. I think you posted a pic of First Seder. But further down, you listed out the facts since the new platform was released in 2007, sort of a timeline. You start with 2007, then you jump to the Cambridge Analytica issue. I actually think that we need to fully examine what Cambridge Analytica did. They either broke a kind of code of conduct. If they broke any other rules or agreements with you all, I hope that they suffer the consequences. But I think that timeline needs to be updated. And it really needs to go back. I've read a series of 3 articles that were published in the MIT Technology Review back in 2012. And it talks about how proud the Obama campaign was of exploiting data on Facebook in the 2012 campaign. In fact, Somebody asked you earlier if it made you mad about what Cambridge Analytica did, and you rightfully answered yes, but I think you should probably be equally mad when a former campaign director of the Obama campaign proudly tweeted, Facebook was surprised we were able to suck out the whole social graph. But they didn't stop us once they realized that was what we were doing. So you clearly had some people in your employ that apparently knew it. At least that's what this person said on Twitter, and thank goodness for Wayback and some of the other history grabber machines. I'm sure we can get this tweet back and get it in the right context. I think when you do your research, it's important to get the whole view. I've worked in data analytics practice for a good part of my career. And for anybody to pretend that Cambridge Analytica was the first person to exploit data clearly doesn't work or hasn't worked in the data analytics field. So when you go back and do your research on Cambridge Analytica, I would personally appreciate it if you'd start back from the first known high-profile national campaign that exploited Facebook data. In fact, they published an app that said it would grab information about my friends, their birth dates, locations, and likes. So presumably, if I downloaded that app that was published by the Obama campaign, I've got 4,900 friends on my Facebook page. I delete the haters and save room for family members and true friends on my personal page, as I'm sure everybody does. Then that means if I clicked yes on that app, I would have approved the access of birth dates, locations, and likes of some 4,900 people without their consent. So as you do the chronology, I think it'd be very helpful so that we can take away the partisan rhetoric that's going on, like this is a Republican-only issue. It's a broad-based issue that needs to be fixed. And bad actors at either end of the political spectrum need to be held accountable, and I trust that you all are going to work on that. I think the one thing so for that, I just want to get to the facts, and there's no way you can answer any of the questions. I'm not going to burden you with that. But I think getting that chronology would be very helpful. The one thing I would encourage people to do is go to Facebook. I'm a proud member of Facebook. Just got a post from my sister on this being National Sibling Day, so I've connected with 4 or 5 of my staff while I was giving you my family undivided attention. But go to the privacy tab. If you don't want to share something, don't share it. This is a free service. Go on there and say, I don't want to allow third-party search engines to get to my Facebook page. Go on there and say, only my friends can look at it. Go in there and understand what you're signing up for. It's a free app. Now, you need to do more, and I think it would be helpful. I didn't read your disclaimer page or the terms of use because I didn't see anywhere in there that I could get an attorney and negotiate the terms, so it was a terms of use. I went on there, then I used the privacy settings to be as safe as I could be with a presence on Facebook. Last thing, we talk about all these proposed legislation, good ideas, but I have one question for you. When you were developing this app in your dorm, how many people did you have in your regulatory affairs division? Exactly. So if government takes a heavy-handed approach to fix this problem, then we know very well that the next Facebook, the next thing that you're going to wake up and worry about how you continue to be relevant as the behemoth that you are today is probably not going to happen. So I think that there's probably a place for some regulatory guidance here, but there's a huge place for Google, Snapchat, Twitter, all the other social media platforms to get together and create standards. And I also believe that that person who may have looked the other way when the whole social graph was extracted for the Obama campaign, if they're still working for you, they probably shouldn't, or at least there should be a business code of conduct that says you don't play favorites. You're trying to create a fair place for people to share their ideas. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Harris.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I've been here for on and off for the last 4 hours that you've been testifying, and I have to tell you, I'm concerned about how much Facebook values trust and transparency. If we agree that a critical component of a relationship of trust and transparency is we speak truth and we get to the truth. During the course of this hearing, these last 4 hours, you've been asked several critical questions for which you don't have answers. And those questions have included whether Facebook can track users' browsing activity even after the user has logged off of Facebook, whether Facebook can track your activity across devices even when you aren't logged into Facebook, who is Facebook's biggest competition, whether Facebook may store up to 96 categories of users' information, whether you knew whether Kogan's terms of service and whether you knew if that Kogan could sell or transfer data. And then another case in point, specifically as it relates to Cambridge Analytica, is, and a concern of mine, is that you, meaning Facebook, and I'm going to assume you personally as CEO, became aware in December of 2015 that Dr. Kogan and Cambridge Analytica misappropriated data from 87 million Facebook users. That's 27 months ago that you became, as Facebook, and perhaps you personally became aware. However, a decision was made not to notify the users. So my question is, did anyone at Facebook have a conversation at the time that you became aware of this breach, and have a conversation wherein the decision was made not to contact the users?
Senator, I don't know if there were any conversations at Facebook overall, because I wasn't in a lot of them, but...
On that subject?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what other people discussed. At the time, in 2015, we heard the report that this developer, Alexander Kogan, had sold data to Cambridge Analytica. That's in violation of our terms.
Correct. And were you a part of a decision, were you part of a discussion that resulted in a decision not to inform your users?
I don't remember a conversation like that. But the reason why...
Are you aware of anyone in leadership at Facebook who was in a conversation where a decision was made not to inform your users, or do you believe no such conversation ever took place?
I'm not sure whether there was a conversation about that, but I can tell you the thought process at the time of the company, which was that in 2015, when we heard about this, we banned the developer, and we demanded that they delete all the data and stop using it, and same with Cambridge Analytica.
And
they told us they
heard your
had.
testimony in that regard, but I'm talking about notification of the users. And this relates to the issue of transparency and the relationship of trust, informing the user about what you know in terms of how their personal information has been misused. And I'm also concerned that when you personally became aware of this, did you or senior leadership do an inquiry to find out who at Facebook had this information, and did they not have a discussion about whether or not the users should be informed back in December of 2015?
Senator, in retrospect, I think we clearly view it as a mistake that we didn't inform people, and we did that based on false information that we thought that the case was closed and that the data had been deleted.
So there was a decision made on that basis not to inform the users, is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And
But in retrospect, I think that was a mistake, and knowing what we know now, we should have handled a lot of things here differently.
and I appreciate that point. Do you know when that decision was made not to inform the users?
I don't.
Okay. Last November, the Senate Intelligence Committee held a hearing on social media influence. I was a part of that hearing. I submitted 50 written questions to Facebook and other companies, and the responses that we received were unfortunately evasive, and some were frankly non-responsive. So I'm going to ask the question again here. How much revenue did Facebook earn from the user engagement that resulted from foreign propaganda?
Well, Senator, what we do know is that the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, the Russian firm, ran about $100,000 worth of ads. I can't say that we've identified all of the foreign actors who are involved here, so I can't say that that's all of the money, but that is what we have identified.
Okay, my time is up. I'll submit more questions for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Harris. Next up is Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I come in peace. I don't want to vote to have to regulate Facebook, but by God, I will. But a lot of that depends on you. I'm a little disappointed in this hearing today. I just don't feel like that we're connecting. So let me try to lay it out for you from my point of view. I think you're a really smart guy. And I think you have built an extraordinary American company. And you've done a lot of good. Some of the things that you've been able to do are magical. But our promised digital utopia, we have discovered, has minefields. There's some impurities in the Facebook punch bowl. And they got to be fixed. And I think you can fix them. Now, here's what's going to happen. There are going to be a whole bunch of bills introduced to regulate Facebook. It's up to you whether they pass or not. You can go back home, spend $10 million on lobbyists and fight us, or you can go back home and help us solve this problem. And there are two. One's a privacy problem. The other one is what I call a propaganda problem. Let's start with the privacy problem first. Let's start with the user agreement. Here's what everybody's been trying to tell you today, and I say this gently. Your user agreement sucks. You can spot me 75 IQ points. If I can figure it out, you can figure it out. The purpose of that user agreement is to cover Facebook's rear end. It's not to inform your users about their rights. Now, you know that, and I know that. I'm going to suggest to you that you go back home and rewrite it. And tell your $1,200 an hour lawyers, no disrespect, they're good. But tell them you want it written in English, in non-Swahili, so the average American can understand it. That would be a start. Are you willing, as a Facebook user, are you willing to give me more control over my data?
Senator, as someone who uses Facebook, I believe that you should have complete control over your data.
Okay. Are you willing to go back and work on giving me a greater right to erase my data?
Senator, you can already delete any of the data that's there or delete all of your data.
Are you willing to expand that, work on expanding that?
Senator, I think we already do what you're referring to, but certainly we're always working on trying to make these controls easier.
Are you willing to expand my right to know who you're sharing my data with?
Senator, we already give you a list of apps that you're using, and you signed into those yourself and provided affirmative consent.
Right.
As I've said before, we don't share any data with...
On that user agreement. Are you willing to expand my right to prohibit you from sharing my data?
Senator, again, I believe that you already have that control. So, I mean, I think people have that full control in the system already today. If we're not communicating this clearly, then that's a big thing that we should work on, because I think the principles that you're articulating are the ones that we believe in and try to codify in the product that we build.
Are you willing to give me the right to take my data on Facebook and move it to another social media platform?
Senator, you can already do that. We have a download your information tool where you can go, get a file of all of the content there, and then do whatever you want with it.
And then I assume you're willing to give me the right to say, I'm going to go on your platform, and you're going to be able to tell a lot about me as a result, but I don't want you to share it with anybody.
Yes, Senator, and I believe you already have that ability today. People can sign on and choose to not share things and just follow some friends or some pages and read content if that's what they want to do.
Okay. Let me be sure I understand. I'm about out of time. Boy, it goes fast, doesn't it? Let me ask you one final question in my 12 seconds. Could somebody call you up and say, I want to see John Kennedy's file?
Absolutely not.
Could you, if it, not could you, not would you do it, could you do it?
In theory.
Do you have the right to put my data, a name on my data, and share it with somebody?
I do not believe we have the right to do that.
Do you have the ability?
Senator, the data is in the system, so...
Do you have the ability?
Technically, I think someone could do that, but that would be a massive breach. So we would never do that.
It would be a breach.
A couple questions for you. To clarify one of the comments made about deleting accounts from Facebook. In the user agreement, it says, when you delete IP content, if it is deleted in a manner similar to, it is deleted in a manner similar to emptying the recycle bin on a computer. However, you understand that removed content may persist in backup copies for a reasonable period of time. How long is that?
Senator, I don't know sitting here what our current systems are on that, but the intent is to get all the content out of the system as quickly as possible.
And does that mean your user data as well? It talks about IP content. Is that the same thing as your user data? It could sit in backup copies?
Senator, I think that that is probably right. I'm not sitting here today having full knowledge of our current state of the systems around wiping all of the data out of backups. So I can follow up with you on that afterwards. But what I can tell you is that
all backups get wiped.
That is certainly the way it's supposed to work.
Has there ever been a failure of that?
Senator, I don't know. If we tell people that we're going to delete their data, we need to do that.
And you do that. Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. A couple of other questions. I think that gets to the heart of this expectation gap, as I call it, with users. Facebook, as I understand it, if you're logged into Facebook with a separate browser and you log into another article, open a new tab in the browser, well, you have the Facebook tab open, and that new tab has a Facebook button on it. You track the article that you're reading. Is that correct?
Senator, I think that there is functionality like that, yes.
Do you think users understand that?
Senator, I think that there is a reasonable, I think the answer is probably yes for the following reason. Because when we show a like button on a website, we show social context there. So it says, here are your friends who liked that. So in order to do that, we would have to.
But if you've got your Facebook browser open and you open up the article in the Denver Post and it has a Facebook button on it, you think they know, consumers, users know, that Facebook now knows what article you were reading in the Denver Post?
Well, we would need to have that in order to serve up the like button and show you who your friends were who would also like that.
So I think that goes to the heart of this expectation gap, because I don't think consumers, users necessarily understand that. I mean, and going through this user agreement, as others have, you do need a lawyer to understand it. And I hope that you can close that expectation gap by simplifying the user agreement, making sure that people understand their privacy. Has there ever been a violation outside of the talk about Cambridge Analytica about the privacy settings? Has a privacy setting violation ever occurred outside of Cambridge Analytica?
I'm not aware that we have had systems that have.
So the privacy setting
a
user uses have always been respected. There's never been an instance where those privacy settings have been violated.
That's my understanding. I mean, this is the core thing that our company does, is you come to Facebook, you say, hey, I want to share this photo, or I want to send this message to these people.
Has there ever been a breach of Facebook data? A hack?
There have been, I don't believe that there's been a breach of data that we are aware of.
Has there ever been a hack?
Yes.
And have those hacks accessed user data?
I don't believe so. I think we had an instance back in 2013 where someone was able to install some malware on a few employees' computers and had access to some of the content on their computers. But I don't believe that they had access to data.
Page. Never affected the user page.
I do not believe so.
Okay. Has the government ever asked to remove a page, have a page removed?
Senator, I believe so.
Okay. And has the government ever, can you get a warrant to join a page, to be on a page, pretending you're a separate user, to be liked by that, to track what that person's doing? Do you need a warrant for that, or can the government just do that, the FBI, anybody?
Senator, I'm not sure I fully understand. You're saying to
we can follow up on that, because I do want to have one final question I want to ask you. A couple days ago, I think Facebook talked about that it would label traditional advocacy as political ads. And for instance, if the Sierra Club was to run a climate change ad, that would be labeled political. political ad. If the Chamber of Commerce wanted to run or place an ad as this would have an impact on the climate change regulations would have an impact, and to talk about that through an ad, that would be labeled as political, which is different than current standards of what is political, what is issue advocacy. Is it your intent to label things political that would be in contradiction to federal law?
Senator, the intent of what we're trying to get at is the foreign election interference that we've seen has taken more the form of issue ads than direct political electioneering advertising. So because of that, we think it's very important to extend the verification and transparency to issue ads in order to block the kind of interference that the Russians attempted to do, and I think will likely continue to attempt to do. That's why I think that those measures are important to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Garner. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for being here today, Mark. I appreciate you coming in. I hope this isn't the last time we see you in front of committee. I know we're approaching 5 hours, so it's been a little tenuous, some mental gymnastics for all of us, and I just want to thank you for being here. Facebook is an American company, and with that, I believe you've got a responsibility to protect American liberties, central to our privacy. Facebook allowed a foreign company to steal private information. They allowed a foreign company to steal private information from tens of millions of Americans, largely without any knowledge of their own. Who and how we choose to share our opinions is a question of personal freedom. Who we share our likes and dislikes with is a question of personal freedom. This is a troubling episode that completely shatters that liberty, so that you understand the magnitude of this. Montanans deeply concerned, they are deeply concerned with this breach of privacy and trust. So you've been at this for nearly 5 hours today. So besides taking reactive steps, and I want you to be as concise as you possibly can, what are you doing to make sure what Cambridge Analytica did never happens again?
Thank you, Senator. There are 3 important steps that we're taking here. For Cambridge Analytica, first of all, we need to finish resolving this by doing a full audit of their systems to make sure that they delete all the data that they have, and so we can fully understand what happened. There are 2 sets of steps that we're taking to make sure that this doesn't happen again. The most important is restricting the amount of access to information that developers will have going forward. The good news here is that back in 2014, we actually had already made a large change to restrict access on the platform that would have prevented this issue with Cambridge Analytica from happening again today. Clearly, we did not do that soon enough. If we'd done it a couple of years earlier, then we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. But this isn't a change that we had to take now in 2018. It's largely a change that we made back in 2014.
Okay.
There are other parts of the platform that we also similarly can lock down now to make sure that other issues that might have been exploited in the future won't be able to. And we've taken a number of those steps, and I've outlined those in my written statement as well.
I appreciate that, and you feel confident that the actions you've taken thus far, whether it was the ones back in 2014 or the one that you just talked about locking down the other parts, will adequately protect the folks who use Facebook?
Senator, I believe so, although security is never a solved problem.
That's all I need. You talked about a full audit of Cambridge Analytica systems. Can you do a full audit if that information is stored somewhere, some other country?
Senator, if right now we're waiting on the audit because the UK government is doing a government investigation of them, and I do believe that the government will have the ability to get into the systems even if we can't.
If information is stored in the UK, but what if it's stored in some other country? What if the information is stored in some other country? Is an audit even possible?
Well, Senator, we believe a bunch of the information that we will be able to audit. I think you raise an important question, and if we have issues, then if we are not able to do an audit to our satisfaction, we are going to take legal action to enable us to do that. And also I know that the UK and US governments are also involved in working on this as well.
I don't really, I'm telling you, I have faith in the US government. I really actually have faith in the UK too. There have been claims that this information is being stored in Russia. I don't care. It could be stored anywhere in the world. I don't know how you get access to that information. I'm not as smart as you are about tech information. And so the question really becomes, and I got to move on, but the question is, I don't see how you can perform a full audit if they've got stuff stored somewhere else that we can't get access to. That's all. Maybe you have other ideas on how to do that.
Well, I think we'll know once we get in there whether we feel like we can fully investigate everything.
Just real quickly, Senator Schatz asked a question earlier about data and who owns the data. I want to dig into it a little bit more. You said, and I think multiple times during this hearing, that I own the data on Facebook if it's my data.
Yes.
And I'm going to tell you that I think that sounds really good to me. But in practice, let's think about this for a second. You're making about $40 billion a year on the data. I'm not making any money on it. It feels like you own the data. And in fact, I would say that the data that was breached through Cambridge Analytica, which impacted, and correct me if these numbers are wrong, some 80 million Americans, my guess is that few, if any, knew that that information was being breached. If I own that data, I know it's being breached. So could you give me some sort of idea on how you can really honestly say it's my data when, quite frankly, they may have goods on me. I don't want them to have any information on me.
Senator, when I say
if I own it, I can stop it.
Yes. So, Senator, when I say it's your data, what we mean is that you have control over how it's used on Facebook. You clearly need to give Facebook a license to use it within our system,
Yeah.
or else the service doesn't work.
Yeah, I know, and this license has been brought up many times today, and I'm going to be quiet in just one second, Mr. Chairman. But the fact is the license is very thick, maybe intentionally so people get tired of reading it and don't want to. Look, Mark, I appreciate you being here. I look forward to having you at another hearing. Thank you.
Senator Young.
Mr. Zuckerberg, thanks so much for being here and enduring the many questions today. I think it's important you're here because your social media platform happens to be the ubiquitous social media platform, and there's not a senator that you heard from today that isn't on Facebook, that doesn't communicate with our constituents through Facebook. In a sense, we have to be on it. And so I think it's especially important that you're here, not just for Facebook, but really for our country and beyond. The threshold question that continues to emerge here today is what are the reasonable expectations of privacy that users ought to have? And I'll tell you, my neighbors are unsatisfied by an answer to that question that involves, take a look at the user agreement. And I think there's been a fair amount of discussion here about whether or not people actually read that user agreement. I would encourage you to, survey that, get all the information you can with respect to that, and make sure that user agreement is easy to understand and streamlined and so forth. Mr. Zuckerberg, earlier in today's hearing, you drew a distinction that I thought was interesting. It caught my attention. It was a distinction between consumer expectation of privacy, depending upon whether they were on an ISP, or the pipes of the internet as you characterized it, or on an edge platform like Facebook. I find this distinction somewhat unsatisfying because most folks who use the internet just think of it as one place, if you will. They think of it as the internet as opposed to various places requiring different degrees of privacy. Could you speak to this issue and indicate whether you'd support a comprehensive privacy policy that applies in the same manner to all entities across the entire internet ecosystem?
Senator, sure. I think that people's expectations of how they use these different systems are different. Some apps are very lightweight, and and you can fully encrypt the data going across them in a way that the app developer or the pipes in the ISP case probably shouldn't be able to see any of the content, and I think you probably should have a full expectation that no one is going to be introspecting or looking at that content.
Give me some quick examples, if you would, kindly, sir.
Sure. Well, when data is going over the Verizon network, I think it would be good for that to be as encrypted as possible and such that Verizon wouldn't look at it, right? I think that that's what people expect, and I don't know that being able to look at the data is required to deliver their service. That's how WhatsApp works too, so that's an app. It's a very lightweight app. It doesn't require us to know a lot of information about you, so we can offer that with full encryption, and therefore we're not looking, we don't see the content. For a service like Facebook or Instagram, where you're sharing photos and then people want to access them from lots of different places, people kind of want to store that in a central place, so that way they can go access it from lots of different devices. In order to do that, we need to have an understanding of what that content is. So I think the expectations of what Facebook will have knowledge of versus what an ISP will have knowledge of are just different.
I think that needs to be clearly communicated to your users, and we'll leave it at that. That those different levels of privacy that the user can expect to enjoy when they're on your platform. I'd like to sort of take a different tack to internet privacy policy with you, sir. Might we create stronger privacy rights for consumers, either through creating a stronger general property right regime online, say a new law that states unequivocally, something that you said before, that users own their online data, or through stronger affirmative opt-in requirements on platforms like yours. Now, if we were to do that, would you need to retool your model? If we were to adopt one of those two approaches.
Senator, can you repeat what the approaches are again?
Yeah, so one is to create a stronger property right for the individual online through a law that states unequivocally users own their data. The other one is a stronger affirmative opt-in requirement to be a user on Facebook. Would you have to fundamentally change the Facebook architecture to accommodate those policies?
Senator, those policies and the principles that you articulated are generally how we view our service already. So depending on the details of what the proposal actually ends up being, and the details do just matter a huge amount here, it's not clear that it would be a fundamental shift. But the details really matter, and if this is something you're considering or working on, we would love to follow up with you on this, because this is very important to get right.
I'd love to work with you. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Senator Thune has a closing comment. And I have a process statement for everybody to listen to.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks to all of our members for their patience. Been a long hearing, particularly long hearing for you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Thank you for sitting through this, but I think this is important. I do have a letter here from the Motion Picture Association of America that I want to get into the record without objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
And just a quick sort of wrap-up question, if you will, and maybe one quick comment. But you've answered several questions today about efforts to keep bad actors, whether that's a terrorist group to a malicious foreign agent, off of your platform. You've also heard concerns about bias at Facebook, particularly bias against conservatives. And I just, as a final question, can you assure us that when you are improving tools to stop bad actors, that you will err on the side of protecting speech, especially political speech, from all different corners?
Senator, yes, that's our approach. If there is an imminent threat of harm, we're going to take a conservative position on that and make sure that we flag that and understand that more broadly. But overall, I want to make sure that we provide people with the most voice possible. I want the widest possible expression, and I don't want anyone at our company to make any decisions based on the political ideology of the content.
Okay. And just one final observation, Chairman Grassley. Mr. Zuckerberg has answered a lot of questions today, but there are also a lot of promises to follow up with some of our members. And sometimes on questions about Facebook practices that seem fairly straightforward, but I don't think we have. I think it's going to be hard for us to fashion solutions to solve some of this stuff until we have some of those answers. And you had indicated earlier that you're continuing to try and find out who among these other analytics companies may have had access to user data that they were able to use. And hopefully, as you get those answers, you will be able to forward those to us, and it'll help shape our thinking in terms of where we go from here. So, but overall, I think it's a very informative hearing, Mr. Chairman, and so I'm ready to wrap it up.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't make this comment, but your response to him in regard to political speech, I won't identify the CEO I had a conversation with yesterday, but one of our platforms, and he admitted to being more left than right, or I mean being left, I guess is what he admitted, and I don't know, I'm not asking you what you are, but but just so you understand that that probably as liberals have a lot of concerns about you know, the leaning of Fox News, or conservatives have questions about the leaning of MSNBC, let's say. It seems to me that when we get, whether it's from the right or the left, so I'm speaking to you for your platform, there's a great deal of cynicism in American society about government generally. And then when there is suspicions, legitimate or not, that maybe you're playing it one way unfairly towards the other, it seems to me that everything you can do to lean over backwards to make sure that you are fair in protecting political speech, right or left, that you ought to do it. And I'm not telling you how to do it, and I'm not saying you don't do it, but we got to do something to reduce this cynicism. At my town meetings in Iowa, I always get this question: how come you guys in D.C. can't get along? You know, meaning Republicans and Democrats. Well, I try to explain to them that they kind of get a obtuse, what would you say, a review of what goes on here, because controversy makes news. So if people are getting along, you never hear about that. So they get a distorted view of it. And really, we congressmen get along more than the public thinks. But these attitudes of the public, we got to change. And people of your position and your influence, you can do a lot to change this. Whether I know you got plenty of time to run your corporation, through your corporation or privately, anything you can do to reduce this cynicism, because we have a perfect constitution. Maybe it's not perfect, but we got a very good constitution, the longest one written constitution in the history of mankind. But if people don't have faith in the institutions of government, and then it's our responsibility to enhance that faith so they have less cynicism in us. You know, we don't have a very strong democracy just because we got a good constitution. So I hope that everybody will do whatever they can to help enhance respect for government, including speaking to myself. I got to bend over backwards to do what I can so I don't add to that cynicism. So sorry you had to listen to me. So this concludes today's hearing. Thanks to all the witnesses for attending. The record will be open for 14 days for the members to submit additional written questions, and for the witness, Mr. Zuckerberg, to make any corrections to his testimony. The hearing is adjourned.